Joining me now is NBC News correspondent Morgan Chesky, who is in Brooklyn Center, Minnesota. NBC News correspondent Gabe Gutierrez, who is in Minneapolis, former chief public defender for Hennepin County, Mary Moriarty, and managing partner of the Cochran firm, California and civil rights trial attorney, Brian Dunn. Everybody welcome. So, Morgan, I do want to start with you. This arrest, what more can you tell us?
Yeah, Katie, good afternoon. We know that this arrest came after those charges were made official around 11 o'clock this morning local time here in Brooklyn Center. We're told that Kim Potter turned herself into the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension earlier today about 11:30, where she faces the charges of second-degree manslaughter. We expect those charges to be officially filed later today. She should be being processed as we speak. Already in response to this, we've heard from Ben Crump, the attorney representing the family of Daunte Wright, who acknowledged that this is a step in the right direction, but made it very clear that this, in their eyes, was not an accident and that she intentionally pulled that trigger, firing the fatal shot that killed 20-year-old Daunte Wright on Sunday afternoon following that traffic stop for expired tabs. We potentially anticipate to hear from the family later today. In the meantime, the scene around the police station here in Brooklyn Center very much reinforced. You can see that high fence, the National Guard Humvees and troops stationed in and around that area. At last check, we know 3,000 National Guardsmen are now here in the Minneapolis area, ready to respond should protests grow out of control. We know that last night there were nearly 60 arrests near where I'm standing, following another night of protests. Police choosing to use tear gas, in some cases rubber bullets, to disperse those crowds that were out after the curfew. No word yet on if that curfew will be in place tonight, or what, if any, protests will be coming following the news of these charges against that 26-year veteran who submitted her resignation yesterday. Katie?
So, Mary, what do you think of the charges here, the probable charge, second-degree manslaughter?
It's angering a lot of people and puzzling a lot of people because it's also a charge that Chauvin is accused of, and it's the least serious charge that he's accused of. So I've certainly seen a lot of talking about why isn't this intentional or why isn't it third-degree murder. So there are a lot of calls for the charge to be changed. There are also calls for this case to be removed from the county attorney who charged it, who puts in time giving legal advice to the Chief of Police Association in Minnesota. And so people have called for the case to be removed from him and given to the Attorney General's office, which is the entity that's charging or prosecuting the Chauvin case right now.
The AG's office declined to do so, though. They thought the county attorney would be well suited to handle this. Mary, what about the speed with which Kim Potter has been charged? Usually it takes a little bit longer than that. And I wonder if all of the unrest we've seen in Brooklyn Center and all of the heightened pressure out there, given the Chauvin trial, meant that this was done a little bit faster.
I'm sure that's true. If you'll remember to last summer, there were numerous calls for the police officers, former police officers in the George Floyd case to be charged. And when he wasn't charged, that's when a lot of the protesting happened. That's when a lot of the unrest happened. And unfortunately, that's when some of the damage happened as well. So I'm sure they were well aware that it was important, if she was going to be charged, to get those charges out as quickly as possible.
Brian, what do you make of these charges? You just heard Mary Moriarty say there's a lot of people out there who think that she should be charged with third-degree murder.
Well, I don't know if there's enough there for that, and thank you very much for the question. This exact phenomenon has happened 2 times in the past in my career, where an officer has fired a real gun and mistakenly believed that they were firing the taser. That is something that is more easy to occur than most people may think. And when we start talking about the concept of intent, the prosecution has to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that it was not a mistake, but rather it was something that this officer intended to do. And in light of the mechanism that can cause an officer to inadvertently draw a firearm, I think that the charges are probably well placed at this point.
Let's switch over to the Chauvin trial, which is happening again just a few miles away from all of the unrest surrounding the death of Mr. Wright. Gabe Gutierrez, a new defense that we are hearing today that we had not heard before, that George Floyd died of possible carbon monoxide poisoning. How's that going over in the courtroom?
Hi there, Katie. So, yes, that partial defense came from the defense's witness that was called this morning, Dr. David Fowler, who you mentioned earlier was a former chief medical officer in Maryland. And he said, while he was questioned, that potential carbon monoxide poisoning as a result of exhaust from that police squad car was a potential contributing factor to George Floyd's death. And Dr. Fowler has said that it was not lack of oxygen that killed George Floyd, but that he died due to cardiac arrest combined with illicit drug use. Now, Katie, we expect the prosecution to hit back hard on this potentially this afternoon during cross-examination. The court is in a lunch recess right now, but Dr. Fowler is seen as one of the defense's most crucial witnesses. The prosecution came up with several medical experts previously, late last week, and early this week, that really stressed the point that George Floyd died due to asphyxia, due to lack of oxygen as a result of Derek Chauvin's actions. And so now the defense is really trying to bring up this witness who some legal experts are saying are, throwing out other potential reasons to cast some doubt in at least one juror, because, Katie, you have to remember, they only need to, create reasonable doubt within one juror to end up with a hung jury. So this is seen as a very crucial witness for the defense. It will be very interesting to see how the prosecution, hits back during cross-examination. Katie?
Mary, I am curious about that. I know that you're a defense attorney, but a prosecution, how do you expect them to go after this witness and this new defense that it was at least partially, or could have at least partially been carbon monoxide, especially when you consider that George Floyd's head was by the vehicle, was where it was, because Derek Chauvin had him pinned down right there?
We got a preview of this when one of the Minneapolis police officers was testifying, and there was a question about the exhaust. The defense asked that in cross-examination, and I think it was a BCA officer testified that this is a hybrid car, and they couldn't even tell it was running because it was so quiet. So we heard about that exhaust issue early on. The state did a really effective cross-examination of the defense use of force expert yesterday. I expect them to do an effective cross-examination of Fowler. One thing that stood out to me is that the state has called an expert cardiologist, a pulmonologist, and a toxicologist. And both of the medical examiner experts said that on various issues, they would certainly defer to those experts. But Dr. Fowler today kind of put himself out there as an expert cardiologist, pulmonologist, toxicologist, all of that. He also is the defendant in a lawsuit in Maryland because he found a death accidental under kind of similar circumstances. So we may hear the state talk about some of that. I should also say that our third-degree murder statute does not require intent to kill. It is also the same one of the same charges that Chauvin's charged with, and so that's why many in the community are saying, why is Kim Potter only charged with manslaughter?
Yeah, the Maryland case that you brought up, where the lawsuit, it's the family of Anton Black, and they're accusing Dr. Fowler of helping to cover up the role that police played in his death. Brian, this lawsuit that we have heard about, you can see all the headlines right here, is it likely to come up in court? And if it does not come up in court, I guess, should it?
Well, Katie, you're bringing up some great points. And the reality is this is going to be a turf war that's going to happen outside the presence of the jury. To the extent that they're going to go into this other case, the judge has to be concerned about whether this is going to be a trial within a trial and whether it'll sidetrack the jury's attention from what they're there to look at. I think that it's going to be an uphill battle to get that evidence in. However, you brought up another really good point that I want to talk about, Katie, which is under the Minnesota statute, they have to simply show that this particular defendant, Chauvin, caused this particular situation. And even if the carbon monoxide turns out to be more relevant than we originally thought, as you alluded to, it's still the actions of this officer that exposed Mr. Floyd to that. So I don't see it as having as much, I don't see the defense as getting very much traction from that, but I'm sure we'll see an effective cross after lunch.
The defense, as Gabe mentioned, as we keep saying a lot, Brian, is just targeting, they just need one juror to say that there's reasonable doubt. At this point in the trial, does the defense have a juror in mind that they might be targeting with this line of questioning?
Well, again, that's so important. We're not in the courtroom, and you would need someone there to be able to accurately answer that great question. Jurors are very communicative, even though they're silent. They're very communicative, and it's very easy to kind of see how they're interpreting information when you start getting into day 4, day 5. I think they made absolutely no headway yesterday at all. This was a much better witness. But the idea of whether or not he actually connected with a jury is something that we would have to be in the courtroom to determine that energy. There is one more very important thing. The prosecution is going to have another case. They have a rebuttal case after the defense rests. And I'm sure that they're probably contemplating different witnesses that can attack the science that we're seeing right now.
Very interesting. And again, because of COVID, there are limited seats inside that courtroom, and there's only 2 reporters allowed in per day. So we don't get a larger sense of what's going on with the jury than just what we get from what we call the pool report on a daily basis. Morgan Chesky, Gabe Gutierrez, thank you so much for your reporting. Mary Moriarty and Brian Dunn, stick with us for the hour.